Hello, and welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith featuring S.J. Sindu for the launch of her new book, BlueSkinned Gods, in conversation with Kristen Arnett. My name is Adam Schuhos, and I'm a bookseller and events host at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. Whether you know us well or this is your first time hearing our name, thank you so much for being part of our community today. And thank you so much for supporting an independent bookstore with your purchases and for supporting the wonderful work of S.J. Sindu. Now, I first want to thank Kristen Arnett for moderating tonight's event. Kristen is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel, Mostly Dead Things, and the story collection, Felt in the Jaw. Also, her new book, With Teeth, is out right now. She's written for the New York Times, Guernica, BuzzFeed, McSweeney's, Guardian, Salon, and many others. She's been a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and a winner of the 9th Letter Literary Award in Fiction and the Coyle Book Award. Thank you so much for being here, Kristen. And it is my utter pleasure to introduce our guest star for the evening, S.J. Sindu. S.J. is the author of the novel Marriage of a Thousand Lies, which won the Publishing Triangle Edmund White Debut Fiction Award, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, and was an ALA Stonewall Honor Book, and was a, ALA Stonewall Honor Book, as well as the author of the hybrid fiction and nonfiction chapbook, I Once Met You, But You Were Dead. She holds an MA in English from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a PhD in English and creative writing from Florida State University. S.J. teaches at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Now it is a joy to say, please join me in welcoming Kristen Arnett and S.J. Sindu.
Yay!
Thank you so much.
Okay. I'm so excited. You're going to read for us, right? You're going to read first.
Yes, I am going to read. And because this is the official launch, I am going to read from the beginning of the book. And then hopefully I will never read from the beginning of the book ever again, because I feel like I've read it so many times and people are probably going to be tired of hearing it. Thank you so much, Kristen, for doing this with me. And thank you everyone for being here. I've gotten really good at just glancing at the chat because I've been teaching on Zoom for over a year. But so I do have a little eye on the chat, but Kristen will handle the question and answer, I think. Okay, so this is BlueSkinned Gods, Chapter 1. The driver slammed the brakes, whipping my head forward and back. A chorus of honks crescendoed in the muggy New Delhi night. A few cars ahead, in the middle of an intersection, an auto rickshaw lay on its side, its 3 wheels still spinning, the metal poles of its sides cracked in half. Tire tracks swirled into a small blue car with its front end smashed. Glass littered the road, glittering pinpricks of light. People surged around us. My father, Aya, opened the door of the taxi, and we pushed our way into the crowd. Aya weaved to the front. I walked in his wake. An older woman was sprawled on the ground next to the auto, thrown out as it tipped over. The auto driver was on his back near her. His eyes stared right up at the sky. Red slashes glistened over their bodies. People shouted in Hindi to call the police, call the ambulance. The woman was still breathing. 2 men tried to lift her. Stop, Aya said. He raised his voice and yelled, Stop. You could make her injuries worse if you move her. He pushed his way into the clearing. I followed out of instinct, as if we had a string tied between us. I'm a doctor, he said. Let me look. The men put her limbs back down. Aya crouched over the woman. He opened her eyes and checked her pulse. She's losing a lot of blood, he said. She needs help or she won't last. Look, someone said. Kalkisami can heal her. A man pointed in my direction. I wondered if he'd been at my prayer meeting earlier or if I'd healed him before. 100 eyes turned toward me. Yes, Kalkisami, another man said. You can heal her. I walked toward the injured woman and knelt near Aya. Up close, the overpowering smell of iron and urine. So much blood. Cavernous slashes in their bodies. I put my shaking hands over the woman's head, where a pool of blood grew on the asphalt. I chanted over and over, my lips quivering with the words, Om Shri Ram, Om Shri Ram, Om Shri Ram. Some of the crowd prayed with me. I closed my eyes against the lights. I chanted and chanted, Om Shri Ram. 12 years earlier, a girl named Rupa arrived at our ashram in Tamil Nadu, India, dying from a sickness only I could cure. This, my father told me, would be my first miracle. It was the eve of my birthday, an important transition. I was the 10th human incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu, and I was turning 10 years old. Like every Friday, the villagers filtered in with rice and lentils, fresh milk from their cows, spinach, moringa, and bitter gourd from their gardens. They put these gifts in front of me as I sat on the only pillow in the room, and took their seats on the bed sheets we'd laid over the cement floor. My father, Ayya, sat to my left, and my cousin Lakshman to my right. We faced the open green door that led to the veranda. The village kids played outside. As a birthday treat, Ayya had promised to let us play with them after the prayer session if Lakshman and I were well behaved and lucky. My mother had wanted to have an eggless cake made to celebrate with the villagers, but Ayya thought it too Western and decadent. One of the village kids had brought a cricket bat for the first time, and he showed it to the others, beaming as they touched it, demonstrating how to hit the ball. I'd asked my parents for a cricket bat for my birthday. I imagined holding it, showing it off to the boys when they came for next week's prayer meeting. Ayya nudged me with his elbow, and I snapped back to attention, ashamed I'd let myself be distracted. Now was not the time for cricket fantasies. Now was the time to focus and prove myself in whatever test would be demanded of me that night. Lakshman jiggled his legs up and down, watching the kids too. He was my first cousin, a year younger, but almost as big and much braver. He had the round face and big eyes that painters always gave Hindu gods. All I had was blue skin. The Sri Kalki Purana, the Hindu text that prophesied my birth and life, said it was on my 10th birthday that my trials as a living god would begin. I would be tested 3 times, and I would have to prove myself worthy of my birth. Ayya had reminded me of the scripture that morning, though I read the Sri Kalki Purana regularly, and I had been anxiously counting down the days to this birthday for over a year. I saw a vision, Ayya had said after our morning meditation. I'd seen a vision too, early with the sunrise. I'd woken up dreaming of goat blood. In the dream, I'd wrapped my hands around the neck of a month-old kid and held tight as it thrashed, then stilled. I'd pushed my hands through its skin and felt its insides. I'd smeared the gummy blood on my face, my chest, my feet, until my skin prickled and grew fur, and my nails knit together into hooves, until I was the goat. But I was afraid to tell Ayya about this dream, afraid my vision meant doom. Thank you.
Yay! Oh, it was just as good to listen to you read that as I imagined it was going to be. So thank you for doing that. I am thrilled to death to be here with you tonight. We were talking about this in the green room, but you and I have been friends and like writing companions since like Lambda when we were there, which is just like such a exciting thing to think about, just like queer writers like being in the world writing such like interesting like different kinds of work, and like to see you like launch this book has been like very exciting. I have like 1 million questions to ask you that I'm gonna run out of time, and I'm not gonna have enough time to ask them all, but I want to remind everyone in the audience there's a little Q&A button down at the bottom that I know that the good people at Brookline already told you about, but if you have a question, it'd be amazing to like go ahead and put that in whenever you think of it, just so like when we get to the end, we can get to everything and make sure every question gets answered, because that way I won't monopolize all of your time. But to just jump right into things, like, holy shit, wow. First of all, what a great opening. And I know you're gonna get this question 1,000 times, and I'm excited to be the first one to ask you on Victor. But like, I really want to ask you about, because this is not your first novel, but like, what was the impulse and like thought process behind this particular book? Like for you, for this, like when it started, like how long ago were you like kind of like, was this percolating in your head? Like, what was the idea behind this? Like the kind of like the genesis of what became BlueSkinned Gods?
Yeah. So, I mean, it actually started in Boston. I finished Marriage of a Thousand Lies in like 2014, and I got an agent, and we were going to send it out. And I was like, okay, it's time for me to write my next book. What is that going to be? And I didn't have any ideas floating around yet. So I started writing a book about a hate crime that happens in Boston after the Boston bombing. And I wrote like 20,000 words and realized that it was a short story, as you do. And so I threw it out and I rewrote it as a short story. But then I wrote a short story in a writers group in Boston called Right Here, Right Now, led by Tony Amato. And it was about a young boy who grows wings, and everyone around him believes that if you get a feather from the wings, they'll heal you. And he ends up, obviously getting all of his feathers plucked out in a very gruesome, terrible way. So that's how this sort of started, this semi-obsession I developed with the idea of a child God, the idea of seeing divinity in a living person. And then, of course, there were other stories, right? The kid that went to heaven, and there's a bunch of other stories like this. So I started thinking about it. I watched this documentary by Vikram Gandhi called Kumare, where he's like a 20-something, filmmaker, and he pretends to be a guru and like amasses this giant following. And and it was just like fascinating to me that people wanted to believe so badly in him, that they believed in him even after he outed himself as a fraud. And that's kind of how this all began. And I started doing more and more research, and Kalki just sort of started to form in my head as a person. And so I started writing it in 2014.
Wow. Wow. I mean, to be fair, it's like, it's a big, sprawling, beautiful, like dense in the best possible way, gorgeous book that, I wanted to, like, you brought it up, so I guess I get to ask you. I'm also a librarian, so it's like the research question is always very near and dear to my heart. But what was like the research like for you writing this? Was it something where you sat and did, first of all, I deeply sympathize with writing something and thinking and then it's a short story, and then like, oh, this is a short story, oh shit, it's a novel. But like, what was that like for this book? Like, were you doing a lot of stuff up front? Did you do it as you went along? Like, what was like that research kind of process? Because there is a lot of different kinds of like idea of like Hindu mythology or like lore and those kinds of things inside of it. Was that stuff that you had brought from like, did you do like a lot of like very in-depth research, or was that something that you kind of like piecemealed out? Like, I'm always fascinated by that. So great. Thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, I did do a lot of research. I mean, thankfully, so I started this book the day after I moved to Tallahassee, Florida to start my PhD. So, I had quit my full-time job, and I wasn't starting school yet. And so I was like, this is the perfect time. I'm going to do all this research. And I just, I live on a main street. There's stuff going by all the time. So I had like a month before school started, and I just really delved in, and I researched as I went. So my process is drafting. So I make a lot of drafts. I go through and I do like, linear. I work linearly, like beginning to end, but I do it fast and I do a lot of drafts. So in between drafts, I would do more research. I read every Hindu text that I could find in translation, which is a lot. There's a lot. And I researched heavily about, well, about a lot of things that are in the book that I can't say because it would give things away that I don't want to give away. But yes, I did do a ton of research, and some of it was, book research. Some of it was like there was a lot of librarian help there, people getting books for me, and especially at Florida State, they were really, really helpful in getting me access to the kind of information that I needed.
I mean, that makes sense because Florida State has a library school there too. So
yeah.
You got a lot of librarians to help with research. That's so interesting. That is a really fascinating thing to think about, because I do think one of the most interesting things about the writing process is like so often for every different writer, like the process is completely different. Like in building and making things, like the idea like of research happening like between drafts is like, first of all, it makes me want to try. I'm like, oh, okay, that's exciting. But this is like also like in terms of like, I don't know, like research also, it's like research adjacent. And I'm like a place writer and I'm very interested in the kind of like world building that happens. And this is a book that has like, right, like you've got like a lot of like very rich detail about like India, but then there's also like a lot of like present day stuff that's like in New York City. And that's also very rich in its own kind of way. And it's like very detailed and like visceral. And like, what was like the process like that for you for writing into these like spaces, like for these characters? Was there like a way in like which you approached it? Or did you like, again, like think about it as you were going through? Because these are like two very kind of different spaces. And also like a person who's going through like as like a coming of age, like what are they like in this kind of like point of innocence from like being like a young person being like, here's home, and then like what is it like being like, okay, I'm in this brand new space and having to look at like this through like very fresh like eyes of like not understanding anything going on around me. So it was like that, like writing like those particular spaces in this book.
I'm very weird about writing place. I like to be in the place when I'm writing about it. So when I was working on the first book, like it didn't really coalesce for me, and it didn't really come together until I moved to Boston and started like walking around and just, feeling it and smelling it and hearing it. And I couldn't go to India. So I based a lot of it on my memories, I guess, idealized memories of Sri Lanka, just because a lot of the places can be very similar, and it's a very isolated ashram. We're not really, exploring a lot of India. And so I based it on my childhood memories of Sri Lanka. And as far as New York City, like I had just spent a lot of time in New York when I started writing the book, because my friend Ev had moved there for the summer and I was visiting a lot. So I was like, down in its grittiness. And we were going to music shows, and it was just, I rely a lot on lived experience for writing place, because I always think that there are details of a place that you can't know unless you are physically there.
Yeah, I will say that like I very much agree with that, because I think like for myself personally, I think so much of like, right, like it's so much of being inside a space is a sensory experience. Like as a writer, how we describe spaces for other people is very much like reliant upon not just like what someone might see, but how they physically feel in the space, or what they hear or smell. Like those kind of tactile experiences feel like very necessary. And the book is like so rich with those kind of details. In this beautiful place-driven way that is gorgeous to read, especially for somebody who loves reading place setting. You brought up like something when you're talking about that, like that the beginning of this book is very like, there's an isolation to like what you were writing, like, right? Like it's contained. Like the lived experience of Kalki is like contained within the ashram, like of this, here's where you are. And I was fascinated by that in like a lot of different ways. So I will ask question at a time about my questions about this, because I don't want to like ask you like 10 at once and then be like, okay, no, answer. But I guess the first thing I'd like to start off with is like the idea of like, because because there's like a loneliness to this, even though it's like very much like it's a family unit and like, you know, this idea of like, you know, here's who I am or here's who I'm supposed to be. But there's this kind of isolation and loneliness to Kalki as like a character, especially as, you know, someone who's trying to grow and love and know the world. And that's like a theme I feel like that carries through, is like this kind of like the shedding of innocence, or the shedding of like the ways in which our eyes open and we see the world around us outside of what our parents or our family or whoever our unit who raises us growing up like talks to us about. So if you could talk even a little bit about like what it was like writing that kind of enclosed space of like, okay, here's where your world is, and the world is like very contained inside the space, and what like exiting the world even in like kind of like ways like looked like for that character, like, and how you approached that.
That's a great question. I really had a lot of isolation when I was young, and not like physical isolation. So Kalki's isolation is more physical, like he's physically just in a rural area and he doesn't really have access to people. But for me, like I was the youngest grandchild for 7 years. I didn't really have a lot of cousins who were my age. And so I was, you know, in childhood, I was isolated in that way. And then as a young immigrant, when I was 7, I was isolated at school. I didn't know English. I didn't know how to communicate with people. And that kind of isolation, I moved around a lot as a kid. So there's isolation there, sort of emotional isolation from peers. And then there's the coming out of that, whenever I did manage to make friends, or whenever I went off to university and I started to create community around me, and how amazing that feels for someone who hasn't really had it consistently. So like I based Kalki in a lot of my own experience with being or feeling isolated from my peers. I was also like the kind of kid that like told on other kids and like, you know, never misbehaved and like always got good grades. And so a lot of kids hated me for that, rightfully so, for the tattletelling. But, you know, so like those kinds of experiences were what, you know, what I put inside of Kalki.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Yes, because I think that's it. It's so interesting to like to read through this book and to see like the ways in like which like how like isolation or like loneliness or those kinds of things like function, and they change and shift like through age but also through experience. And it's like it's handled very deftly. Like you do this like very, it's like peeling open, like I don't know, like have a slow peel of like a piece of fruit. Like it's done like very like well in this way where it's like it's not all at once, like, oh, here's like the big reveal. It's like this very paced, like beautiful way that even as I was reading it, I was kind of feeling like I was like unlearning and learning. And that kind of like brings me to, God, I have so many questions. This brings me to like a question that I have just about like, I mean, this book specifically for you, but also just how I feel about like writing and how we approach like the things we're trying to make, any kind of art. And this is like, I think this is a book of questions. It's a book of like questions like that beget questions. And so I guess like I wanted to ask, like, in the process of writing this book, like what was like my reference librarian brain is going to ask you this, but it's like I feel like a lot of times, I'll explain up front, like I feel like a lot of times at the reference desk, people come up and ask a question, and what your job is to do is to uncover the thing that they're trying to get at that's underneath, which is like what I kind of think of as the question underneath the question, which is quite often connected, but its own separate animal. And so for you in writing this book, what was like the question underneath the question for you that you were trying to uncover, that maybe you discovered in the process of writing it, in the process of drafting, or maybe like you discovered like after it was done through editing, like what was the question that you found like beneath that you were trying to like, that you found that you were actually trying to get at?
I I really thought at the beginning I was writing about people's need to believe, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. But the question underneath, and the one I discovered after, was that I wanted to know what faith meant to people, because it's something that I don't understand. Faith, like, I have faith in a lot of things, but I don't have faith in an outside sort of entity that's watching over me. That kind of faith in a divine being. I wanted to understand it, and I wanted to understand it as an outsider going in. And that, to me, I don't know if I've uncovered any answers, but I've definitely uncovered a lot more questions. And I always really fully believe in writing from a place of inquiry, and asking questions rather than writing toward an answer. I just think it makes for better art.
Yeah, I think the best kinds of thing is, like, I usually care less about an answer, because I feel like the answer is never the permanent answer. It's like an answer in a moment, or it's like maybe like a part way answer, a partial answer. And then I'm way more interested in a question that comes out of asking a question. And I think this is a book that does that a lot, which I think, obviously shows that it's doing such tremendous work, like digging at itself, right? Like trying to dig down into like what it wants to know, and which makes it feel like it's in conversation, which I think is the most exciting thing about really beautiful art, is that I think really beautiful art makes you feel like you want to talk to it and like ask yourself your own question, and forms like other kinds of art. And so, yeah, that's an amazing answer. I love that. I love the idea of like looking through something and finding like only more questions, which I think is like also too, like if we're talking about like the mythology and lore, or like I was listening to a podcast that you had done about this book, the Desi podcast, and it was like you guys were talking about like the idea of like, this isn't a book about faith, it's an idea of like the loss of faith, or like the removal of faith, which I think is like so much more interesting to think about, because of the idea of like, what is it like to feel this kind of like, it's like this usually like a very gradual thing, or like, and it paired up against this idea of like the loss of like innocence of childhood, or like the ways in which like you can like feel this like estrangement, or like from the self, but also from family or from friends. What was it like writing about this kind of like loss of belief, or like separation, and in conjunction with the idea of like, right, like this kind of like lore that's very much like attached to this, like the Hindu mythology that's like attached to this character, but also to like, like an entire, like this book is like so steeped in everything. What was that like for you?
I mean, because I've been part of the queer community for a long time, I've seen a lot of people lose their faith. And for some people, it's not that big a deal. And for others, it is really intense. And I while I was writing this book, one of my very good friends from grad school was going through this kind of experience, losing faith, and we kept having conversations, and she would often say stuff that I wouldn't even think about, like having to contend with mortality, as somebody who might have believed that you're going to live in heaven with God, and then like having to understand death from a different perspective, after losing that kind of faith. So I was really interested in those questions, and because for me I didn't go through that intense of a process. I was just sort of like about it all, and so but a lot of my friends, especially from my college days, then started to find faith, or like want to find faith again after losing it, and so like there was just a lot of faith-based stuff going on. I think maybe it's just how old I was. Like I was in my late 20s when I was writing this, and I don't know, maybe it's just like the time, we're in the time of social media, and like a lot of people are questioning faith right now. So yeah, like all of those things were happening around me, and I was just very really, really, started paying attention more. And at the same time, like fundamentalist Hinduism is on the rise in India as I'm writing the book. And it's like I'm watching the bad parts of what faith can do, like in real time, as religious minorities get harassed and discriminated against. And then I come from Sri Lanka, where Hindus, Christians, and Muslims were a minority and were being attacked. And like there's this, faith can be used in so many ways, and some of them are beautiful, and some of them are quite terrible. And that was really my concern, is that like when you lose faith, what else do you lose along with it? Do you lose your conscience? Do you lose morality? Do you, is there something you have to rebuild after that loss?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. I grew up a Southern Baptist. And so it's like, I deeply identified with this idea of this kind of like losing of it too, which I think you're totally right. You said before, that's just like many queer people kind of go through this experience. It was very fascinating to watch the ways in which you were talking about the ways in which like the idea of like what it can mean to like understand that the things that you have like been told to yourself and that you've internalized as part of your like integral self and being, to like kind of have to come to an understanding that those things are false. And I think that that's a deeply, even if it's not what we're dealing with, what Kalki's dealing with, I think every human being deals with that on a deeply different internal human level, where it's like the kind of like coming to an understanding that we don't understand anything about ourselves as a person. And I think like so much of this is like, I'm always like deeply fascinated about the stories told inside of families. And right. And so many times inside of families, stories about families are wrapped up in like religion. And that is very much like here. And so like, I love to read the ways in which like, right, like the idea of like the mythology of who Kalki is like supposed to be versus like the lived experience of what he's learning from his like family that lives around him, and like the storytelling that happens, like right, like every like kind of domestic household has this like internal storytelling that happens inside of there. And oh God, I'd love for you to talk about like kind of weaving that narrative, because I think it's so fascinating. It's fascinating to be like, I'm like, right, like, because every human being is like an amalgam of like the kind of ingested like stories that we learn from the people who raise us, and also like the world in which we live. And then those are like it's how we learn, I think as writers, even it's how we learn to like go out and like write or like tell stories to other people. Like even the ways we share stories at parties, I think, like or over a beer, is like kind of learned behavior from how like we kind of are in this way. So I'd love for you to talk about like the kind of mythology of the household here, or like the mythology of the domestic. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you put it that way. And I think in this book, I really just wanted to take all of those kinds of domestic mythologies and like expand them to be as big as possible. So it's not just that like they're telling fun stories about Kalki as a child. They're literally telling the story of his birth and how, and connecting it to his divinity. And in a lot of ways, I think every child thinks themselves as a little god for a long time. Like it's, as a child, your perspective is really sort of insular, and you think that you're the center of the world. And like I said, I was very spoiled as a child. I was, the oldest grandchild. I had a lot of aunts and uncles who spoiled me. And so I maintained that illusion for much longer probably than I should have. And so I sort of saw, and because of like, I didn't have a lot of cousins my age, I hung out with a lot of adults, and that means that I was around them when they were telling me stories. So my family experiences are often like people would tell stories over and over. We were also living in Sri Lanka during a war, and war stories are an important part of how people cope. And that the like that process of storytelling in the family sphere is part of what holds families together, I think. And it's part of what holds my family together and binds me to them. And that's where I learned how to tell stories, is from, you know, my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles, my parents, because they tell stories that connected me to my lineage. And I've lost track of your initial question, but so at this point I'm rambling. But yeah, it's really about, for me, that process of the domestic story building is such an important part of being in a family. And I'm really grateful that I retained my knowledge of Tamil and my fluency so that I can still participate in it. And here in Toronto, I get to be around family quite often, which is really nice, and to participate in that kind of storytelling again.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. I like the I do feel like there's like this kind of connective tissue that kind of like is like, right, it's like there, even if it's like this kind of like thread that like gets pulled like really taut and like really thin and really fine, like that tissue is still there. And I do think like it's fascinating to think about the ways in which like we like kind of use that like very tender, tenuous little fiber to like like all the different like webs that are attached, and like in terms of storytelling, it's really beautiful. Oh, it's very gorgeous writing. I like the idea too of talking about like in terms of thinking about like family, or like, because I think also too, I mean, this is a book that's a queer book. I mean, you're a queer writer, and like your writing is queer. Your last novel was a very queer book also. And when we're thinking about this, is gonna be a two-part question. We're thinking about, because I was like, I know I'm gonna run out of time and I gotta ask the ones I really want to ask. I wanted you to, if you would, talk about like, what was it like writing queerness in this book? What did that look like for you versus your last novel even? And then secondly, like, and when in thinking about like, right, like rethinking the idea of family through like a queer lens, you know, and like what community looks like. Because I think this is also very much a book about community. And I think community is like such a, like, community is queer. Like I think that too. So I'd love for you to talk about those two different things, like in whatever like piecemeal way you would like to. I know I'm like throwing multiple questions at you at once.
That's fine. I think, yeah, you're right. Like I'm really sort of obsessed with the idea of community and how it builds. And I've seen, you know, different kinds of communities and what holds them together. Like there's the family as community, right? The extended family as community, and my extended family is giant, and there's lots of people, and so I'm looking at that. I'm also looking at immigrant communities and you know, what holds them together in a specific place. When, you know, like my parents were one of, I don't know, probably like 500 Sri Lankan Tamil families in the Boston area. And then we moved to South Dakota, where we were one of two families. And you know how communities can grow and shrink, and then of course I came out in college and started building community, and started, you know, being an activist and getting involved, and actively participating in that kind of community building of progressives and queers in Nebraska at that particular time. And I think it's not easy to build community. It's actually really, really hard to build community. And so these are queer practices. But in terms of the book, so like both of my novels have this aspect of community, right? Like it's a fairly isolated protagonist trying to and yearning to find and build their own community. And in some ways they do find it. But, you know, Marriage of a Thousand Lies was specifically a coming out story. It was about being queer, and I wanted to write a story in which it didn't really matter. It's just, you know, he just happens to be queer. And his story is about, you know, his identity, but in more based around faith and religion, and you know, this question that he's always that's looming large in his life. What, you know, am I what everyone tells me I am, or am I a fraud? And that's such a big question that he really doesn't have time for a lot of the smaller questions about, like, you know, gender, sexuality, or anything like that. He's more focused on, like, am I a fraud or not?
Right. Yeah. I love that, because I do think, like, right, like the idea of, like, there's no, like, just like there's no single narrative, there's no single queer narrative. Like, there would be, like, no, like, right, like, what does, like, a queer story look like? That's another thing you talked about in this podcast I was listening to. I was like, I loved this podcast that you're on. I listened to it, I was like, yes, it's very fascinating to me. But, like, a thing that you talk about that I think, like, is an interesting, fascinating thing, if you wouldn't mind talking about again, is you talk about, like, you were like, the idea of, like, when you were trying to sell even, like, your first book, maybe it was like the idea that, like, if it's like people, like, saying to you, because this is, like, queer and also South Asian, like, these things, or it's like pigeonholes it will only appeal to this, like, audience that is, like, queer and South Asian, and, like, that audience is small, and so it's like this isn't, like, a broad enough kind of, like, saleability for things. And in reality, like, we as, like, writers who are, like, you know, like, in these kind of spaces, understand that, like, the idea of a story means that, like, adding in, like, the more things to that, the more, like, different disparate parts, and not even disparate parts, but parts that go together, make it a more relatable story, or a more like, broad, exciting story. And what was the process for you for, like, thinking about, like, because I think you, like, because you talked about, like, what you thought, like, maybe your audience was, but, like, did you see this, like, in terms of writing this book, like, were you, like, who were you thinking about? Like, were you thinking about, like, here's who I am in the construct of this book as I'm writing it, or were you thinking about, like, a broader kind of audience, and, like, what that felt like? It's like weird to, like, think about writing. I always think about writing being as inside a silo, but I know it's really not. Like, so, like, what was that like for this specific book, after writing this, you know, like, Marriage of a Thousand Lives, which was, like, amazing book, and, like, got beautifully received, and, you know, for reasons that are obvious, right? It's a great book. But yeah, so what was that like with, like, this specific book?
For this specific book, I really imagined a mainstream audience, whatever that means, right? I guess it means, like, a middle-aged white woman, right? in the US and Canada, at least, like,
Right.
that's your average reader. But I wanted a mainstream audience, because I felt like there is no specific audience for this book. Obviously, it has that South Asian bent to it. There's the religious aspect to it. But his story is so singular and so different from anyone's that if I wanted to, like, target an audience, I don't think I could have. So I wrote it for a big audience, hoping that, you know, it would make it. But I think between 2017, when Marriage came out, and now, there's a lot of societal, cultural changes that have happened. Like, Hollywood somehow discovered that non-white protagonists could lead a movie. And, like, that hadn't happened in 2017. That there was still that myth that if you have a non-white actor playing the lead, that movie would not do well. Right. But that's clearly not true. And then all these movies have come out to prove them wrong. And I think the same has happened with books, that the book industry, the publishing industry, has realized between then and now that if you have the more specific identities you're dealing with, the more, like, your audience grows.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and obviously you are right, because, like, it's like it has been proven and shown that these are, like, things that, like it's not like a small, like it's not a winnowing down. It's like an expansion. It's like really exciting.
Yeah.
I'm like going over my time. Okay, I have to ask you audience questions now. So I see we have some in the Q&A. If you have a question and haven't asked it yet, like please pop in there, the little button down at the bottom with the little boop boop, like the little like windows in it, like ask a question. I'm going to ask these because I can't take up all your time, even though I want to. So the first question we're going to ask is like, what inspired you? Where did you get the idea for this book? Like you said a little bit about that, but was there like anything outside of like the thing we already talked about?
I was I love looking at headlines for story ideas, and I love like combining 2 or 3 different headlines to make a story.
That is such a good like writing prompt. Actually.
Yeah, it's a great writing prompt. It works really well. I came across this headline of this young girl in India who was born. She essentially ate her twin in the womb, and she was born with multiple limbs, and the doctors were trying to operate on her to remove the other limbs, and people didn't want that to happen. Like the people around her family, surrounding them, did not want that to happen because they believed that the multiple limbs were signs of divinity, and that she was a vessel for the goddess. And I thought that was so fascinating, and that's kind of what started turning the gears in my head to arrive at this particular story.
Wow. Oh my God. I'm going to use that now. That is like, I feel like we've all gotten a little like idea here for this. I love the idea of like combining like the idea of like multiple headlines. Okay. Yes. Great. Thank you so much for that. Take that for myself. Okay. Yeah, okay. I'd love to hear what the differences were in the process and experience of writing between your first and second novels. Like, what was that? Because I think for myself, there was such a difference between novel number 1 and novel number 2. What was that difference? Like, what was the experience like as you were doing that?
It did feel really different. Mostly because the second time around, I knew I could do it. Like I had already produced something. I had already written a novel and revised it and like sent it off to publication. So I knew that it was possible at least. So when I was feeling like stuck in the weeds, which happens quite often in the middle of writing a novel, when it's so just sort of floppy and like there's parts that don't fit and like the writing isn't good in a lot of places. Like there's this hopeless feeling like, oh, is this ever going to come together? But I knew that it would. I had faith that it was going to work out in the end, that I was somehow going to pull it all together and buff out the seams. Because that's my biggest concern, is that readers will read it and like see exactly where I inserted things or like piece things together. But I know that in the final product, that won't be visible. I also think it was different. It took exactly the same amount of time, so it wasn't faster or anything, but I did procrastinate less. The first novel, there were a lot of moments where I didn't work on it because I just couldn't make myself do it. I hadn't learned how to do it yet. But this time around I could sit down and actually work on it when I needed to work on it.
Yes, that's good. That's amazing to hear. It's like I love the idea of like, okay, like we have like developed practice and we understand we can do it because we have done it. I am hoping to bring that to myself. I would love to have an understanding that I can do anything. I love that yes, I'm going to take this like level of confidence and then I'm going to ingest it into myself. I'm learning. I feel like I am taking a lot away from this. Okay, so I'm so moved by what you said about immersing yourself in a space you are writing about. That sort of research is invaluable. And yet white writers continue to colonize our cultures and lived experiences to add color to their writing. How do we impress upon others, namely our students, that immersion is integral to the writing process and we cannot Google our way to authentic voice? And this is from Rita.
Hi, Rita. I try really hard to talk to my students about what it means to write authentically, because it can mean a lot of different things. And I do think that everybody should be striving for diversity in their work. But there's a difference between writing diverse characters and like writing from their perspective.
Mhm.
And like these are two different things. And they're I hate when I'm reading and somebody has used some ethnicity, sometimes it's South Asian, sometimes it's something else, as a dash of spice, as a dash of color in what is otherwise a regular mainstream white work.
Mhm.
I really dislike that. It happens with queer stuff too, like
Sure,
throw in a drag queen if you need a little
Yeah.
sass.
Mhm.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to stop people from doing that, but I think that for me, I approach it as asking students and others why they want to write this particular person or this particular experience. Especially if you're writing from the perspective of someone who is marginalized in a way that you are not.
Mhm.
Why do you want to do that? Is your interest sort of genuine, or is it coming from a place of like tokenism? Is it coming from a place of voyeurism? And I think sometimes it is voyeuristic.
Sure.
And and that is super problematic. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I think that Alexander Chi has a great list of questions that he it's published somewhere. It's published in a big place, I think, and I love those questions. And I think again, returning to that place of inquiry is important, because sometimes there is an expertise being faked that cannot be faked. You can't fake lived experience, and no matter how much how much research you do, you cannot do it. And if you do write outside of your own demographic, I am a huge fan of authenticity readers, sensitivity readers. I had 3 for BlueSkinned Gods. I had because I was writing about caste. I was writing about I have a trans character, and like Hucky is in a Brahmin family, and I don't have experience in any of those things.
Right.
So I did, with the help of Soho, hire 3 readers who helped so much. I ended up changing so much because this is a really important process that I think we should all embrace, and not just be like, oh, sensitivity readers. I've heard like people be really weird about sensitivity readers. Sensitivity readers are great. They're keeping you from making really big mistakes.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you're totally right. And it's a way in which it's like, I mean, we're not afraid of, we shouldn't be like afraid of editing. And that's like in a way in which it's like, right, like, let's take a look at like, in terms of like what we're trying to like make in terms of like character and like, why would it be a weird thing to be like, let's ask someone that knows instead of like pretending. Like, you're completely right. And also, yes, Alex Chi knows everything. So like definitely Google that, because it is, it's an invaluable advice. Okay, so this is from Alana Masad. She says, congratulations and thrilled for you, which yes. Here's the question. I'm so interested in how you manage the point of telling in the novel, the place from which Kalki is telling his story. He very slowly teases out details and lets readers on the part of the story. Even though he feels like a very skillful storyteller, it never feels contrived. It feels natural. So my question, I guess, are how did you write a child from an adult's perspective, and how did you figure out the pacing of the story?
The pacing took a long time. I knew that I couldn't write specifically just from a child perspective, because I really wanted Kalki to be wiser than that. I wanted him to have a perspective that he wouldn't be able to have as a child. So, and I didn't want to give you the ending of his story at the end. So I put it in the middle. It's actually near the beginning, where we actually see him as an adult and we get to sort of be in his shoes as he decides to write the story. And so, like, there's that aspect, but trying to figure out pacing took me the majority of the time that I spent writing this novel, many years. I went back and forth with my writing workshops. I went back and forth with my agents. I tried so many different structures for this novel. At one point, it was dual timeline, like there was Kalki in New York and there was Kalki as a child in India, and it was intercut between them. It didn't work, but it helped to bring to light what was important at each moment in his life and what he sounded like and how that is different as he grows. What his thought process looks like as a child is different from what it looks like when he's a teenager. So it's helped me figure out all of those things. And then I really resisted the linear pacing, but once I put it back in linear form, everything just sort of clicked.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, this was my original structure and it's the structure I returned to, but there was a lot of process in the middle there that I had to go through to really figure out his voice.
I think that's just like, right. Like, it's like, seems like it's like growing pains of like learning how the novel grows. You're like, right. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I know that like we have very little time left, so I'm going to ask like one last question, even though we have three. An anonymous attendee asked, "What is next for you? Like, what are you working on now, or like what is the next like project for you that's going to happen?"
Yeah, so I'm working on my third novel, third literary novel. Right now it's called Poor Child, and it's about Tamil immigrants in Scarborough. And I'm really, really excited about it. I'm in the beginning stages though. I'm like doing the second draft and I'm like, it's that moment where you want to throw it out the window. But I'm progressing through it. I also have a chapbook coming out in February from Black Lawrence Press called Dominant Genes. And in 2023, I have a middle grade graphic novel, fantasy graphic novel coming out called Shakti.
That's so cool. I love that. I love it too. It's like, right, like when like this stuff is still in the weeds, it's like, here's kind of what it is, but you don't even want to necessarily say too much about like what it is, because it's like, will it even be that thing?
Yeah.
Even a year from now. Well, no one's interrupted us yet, so I'm going to ask you another question. Oh wait.
No, it's okay. You can do another one.
Okay, let me get like at least one more.
Yeah.
You mentioned your process for writing novels was with drafts. How long were your breaks between drafts, and how did that help you with writing this novel in the long
run? Sometimes my breaks were like a week because I just couldn't wait to return to it. And sometimes I would go for a couple months without work, in between drafts. So it really depends, but it's never like a couple days, and it's never like super long, like 6 months or something. It's usually somewhere between like 1 week and like 3 months.
Good. Can we ask the last one too? Is that all right?
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have to ask the last one.
We can't not. Yeah.
Yes. What was your hope in including the Hijra performers in the book, and how would you say they impacted Kalki? I'm sorry if I mispronounced it that.
Oh no, it's fine. Yeah, so there are a group of Tirunangegal who perform with at Kalki's ashram, and he befriends one of them. I realized that because he's supposed to be the incarnation of Vishnu, and because it just made sense. Of course, this is India. In any like huge religious function, of course they would have a Tirunange presence. And this was also far enough back before that community got really political and started to go into more activism than their traditional role as performers. So, it would have been right around before that shift really happened. So I knew that I had to include it. It wouldn't feel authentic otherwise.
Yay. Sorry. I'm so glad. I was like, I have to get through everyone's questions since I went over
Yeah.
with my own.
No, don't worry about it.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
Thank you. Are you kidding? I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Brookline, also for letting me
Thank you.
yap at my beautiful writer friend.
Thank you both so much, SJ, Kristen. That was absolutely fantastic. Everybody out there, thank you so much for coming tonight. Really appreciate it. If anybody would still like to grab a copy of BlueSkinned Gods, you can go to the Eventbrite page where you registered for this event. You can get a copy there. You can go to brooklinebooksmith.com and get one from our online store, or you can just come on to the store. We have both SJ and Kristen's books in stock, and you will also get a signed book plate from the authors if you order through us. So please do. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, SJ, Kristen, one more time. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
And happy launch.
Thank you so much.
Happy launch.
Thank you.
Happy launch.
Yay.
Congratulations. All right, everyone. Have a great night. Take care.
Bye.